He thought he was making an arrest, but in reality, he was stepping into a trap already set for him. The rain fell in thin, steady lines across the dimly lit street, reflecting the red and blue glow of the patrol car like a warning no one else seemed to hear. And in the middle of it all stood Ava Carter, her wrists held firm in front of her, her posture calm in a way that didn't match the tension in the air, while Officer Daniel Hayes circled her with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, never been challenged. His voice sharp as he spoke loudly enough for the growing crowd. You match the description. As phones lifted, whispers spread, and judgment filled the space before facts ever could. But Ava didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even flinch. Instead, her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, not toward the officer, but past him, up to the small black camera mounted above the streetlight, blinking quietly in the corner, recording everything, capturing every word, every movement, every assumption. And for just a second, there was something in her expression that didn't belong to someone losing control. It belonged to someone waiting, someone measuring time in seconds instead of fear. And Daniel noticed it, if only for a flicker, a hesitation buried deep beneath his authority. But he pushed it aside, because men like him didn't question instincts, they acted on them. He reached for her arm again, guiding her toward the back of the patrol car, the door opening with a hollow sound that echoed louder than it should have, as if the moment carried more weight than anyone realized. And still she said nothing, just that same steady breathing, that same unreadable calm, as if this wasn't the worst moment of her day, but the exact moment she had been expecting, the one she had prepared for, the one that had to happen. And as the door shut and the noise of the street faded into a dull hum, Ava finally shifted her gaze to him, not angry, not afraid, just certain. And in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared into the silence, she asked, "Are you done?" And somewhere far above them, in an office neither of them could see, a phone began to ring. The patrol car moved through the wet streets with a low, steady hum, the city lights stretching into blurred lines across the windows. But inside the vehicle the silence felt heavier than anything outside. Officer Daniel Hayes kept his eyes forward, one hand resting on the wheel, the other tapping lightly as if trying to shake off something he could not name, because there was something about her stillness that did not sit right. Most people talked, most people argued, most people tried to explain, but Ava Carter sat in the back seat without a single word, her hands resting calmly in front of her, her breathing even, her gaze fixed on the faint reflection of the passing streetlights, as if she was following a pattern only she understood. And for a moment Daniel glanced at her through the rearview mirror, expecting fear, expecting anger, expecting something he could recognize. But all he found was composure, the kind that did not come from ignorance, the kind that came from certainty. And he looked away quickly, tightening his grip on the wheel as he spoke more to himself than to her, saying that people always act calm when they know they are caught, trying to convince himself that this was no different, that this was routine, just another stop, just another report, just another name to file away. But the words did not land the way they usually did. They felt hollow, like they were missing something important. And in the back seat, Ava slightly tilted her head, not reacting to his statement, but to something else entirely. Something beyond the car, beyond the street, as if she was listening to a rhythm he could not hear. And then she closed her eyes for just a second, not in defeat, not in exhaustion, but in quiet acknowledgement, like a signal passing through an invisible line. And somewhere across the city, in a dimly lit office filled with monitors and files, a small red indicator blinked on a screen, unnoticed by most but not by everyone, because a man in a dark suit leaned forward, his expression sharpening. As he reached for a phone that had just started ringing, his voice calm as he answered, confirming a name, confirming a location, confirming a moment that had been waiting to happen. And back inside the patrol car, Daniel exhaled slowly, unaware that every mile he drove was not taking control of the situation but bringing him closer to something already in motion, something that had begun long before he ever stepped out of his car that night. And as the station lights finally came into view, glowing cold and bright against the rain, Ava opened her eyes again, her reflection steady in the glass. And for the first time since the cuffs closed around her wrists, the corner of her lips moved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something far more unsettling, recognition. The station doors opened with a low mechanical buzz, and the moment Ava Carter stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted in a way that most people would not notice, but she did. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant ringing of phones, the quiet conversations that paused just a fraction too long as eyes turned toward her, not openly, not boldly, but enough to feel the weight of assumption settle into the room. Officer Daniel Hayes walked a step ahead, his posture firm, his voice carrying just enough authority as he announced the intake without looking back, as if the outcome had already been decided the second he saw her on the street, and Ava followed without resistance, her steps measured, her gaze calm, taking in every detail, every badge, every camera, every reflection in the glass panels that lined the hallway, because this was not unfamiliar territory to her. It was mapped, studied, understood long before this moment, and still she said nothing, not when they stopped at the desk, not when her name was requested, not when Daniel filled out the report with quick, confident strokes, summarizing her into a few lines that fit neatly into his version of the story. And for a moment, everything appeared normal, routine, exactly the way it had gone 100 times before, until it did not, because across the room a phone rang again, sharper this time, persistent, and a senior officer reached for it with a slight frown, his expression changing almost immediately as he listened, his eyes lifting slowly toward Daniel, toward Ava, toward something he could not yet explain, and the energy in the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like the air tightening before a storm. Daniel noticed it, but misread it, assuming it was just another distraction, another interruption in a long shift. He exhaled and continued writing, pressing harder on the paper, as if control could be reinforced through certainty. But Ava stood there unmoved, her hands still, her shoulders relaxed, her silence louder than any protest could have been. And when the officer across the room spoke her name out loud, carefully, deliberately, it did not sound like a question, it sounded like confirmation. And for the first time Daniel paused, just for a second, just enough for doubt to slip in before he pushed it back down, telling himself that names meant nothing, that paperwork meant nothing, that he had seen this before. People trying to sound important, trying to create confusion, trying to escape consequences. But Ava finally lifted her eyes to meet his, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, understanding. And in that quiet moment, with the station lights buzzing overhead and the rain still tapping faintly against the windows, it became clear that whatever was happening was not new to her. It was expected, it was part of something already in motion, and Daniel, without realizing it, had just stepped into the center of it. The room did not erupt, it did not freeze, it simply shifted, and sometimes that was more dangerous than chaos, because shifts were quiet. They moved beneath the surface, unnoticed until it was too late. The senior officer lowered the phone slowly, his eyes still fixed on Ava Carter, as if the name alone carried weight he could not ignore. And across the desk, Officer Daniel Hayes felt it, that subtle change in the air, the way conversations did not fully resume, the way eyes lingered a second, too long before looking away. But he straightened his shoulders, forcing control back into his posture, reminding himself that nothing had changed, that this was still his report, his arrest, his call. And he spoke again with a firmer tone, asking for confirmation, asking for processing, pushing the moment forward before it could turn into something else. But Ava did not move. She did not rush. She did not resist. Instead, she stood there as if time itself had slowed around her, her gaze steady, her breathing even, her presence no longer blending into the background but quietly commanding it. And then, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she spoke, not to Daniel, not to anyone in particular, but into the space itself. You might want to check that again. And the words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like a fact, simple, grounded, unavoidable. And for a moment no one responded, because certainty spoken that calmly had a way of cutting through noise. The senior officer cleared his throat, stepping forward now, his movements more careful, more deliberate, as he repeated her name, slower this time, as if aligning it with something he had just been told, something that did not match what was in front of him. And Daniel felt the first real crack in his confidence, not visible, not spoken, but there, a hesitation in the way his hand rested on the desk, a question forming that he refused to ask, because asking meant uncertainty, and uncertainty meant losing control. And he had built his entire identity on never losing control, but the room was no longer responding to him the way it had minutes ago. The authority in his voice did not land the same. The rhythm of the station had shifted away from him, and Ava saw it, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with recognition, because this was the moment where perception began to break, where the story he believed started to slip against the truth he could not yet see. And somewhere down the hall footsteps approached, measured, intentional, not rushed but undeniable. The kind of steps that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. And as those footsteps drew closer, echoing softly against the polished floor, the quiet in the room deepened, because everyone could feel it now. Something was arriving, something that had been set in motion long before this night, long before this arrest, long before Daniel Hayes ever decided who Ava Carter was supposed to be. And for the first time since the handcuffs closed around her wrists, he was no longer the one in control of what happened next. The footsteps did not rush, they did not echo with urgency, but every step carried weight, the kind that shifted attention without demanding it. And as the figure appeared at the end of the hallway, the entire room seemed to realign around that presence. A man in a dark suit, composed, deliberate, his expression calm but focused, the kind of calm that came from certainty rather than control. And the moment his eyes landed on Ava Carter, there was no hesitation, no confusion, just recognition, immediate and unmistakable. The senior officer straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his posture as if responding to a rank that had not yet been spoken aloud. And Daniel Hayes felt it again, stronger this time. That quiet shift that no longer felt subtle. Something was wrong, not in the loud, obvious way, but in the kind of way that slowly pulled the ground out from under you without warning. And he turned, watching as the man approached, his badge still clipped neatly at his chest, his report still half completed on the desk, but none of it seemed to hold the same weight it had minutes ago. The man stopped just a few feet away, his gaze moving from Ava to Daniel, measuring, not with hostility, not with anger, but with quiet assessment, as if everything in this room was being placed into a context Daniel could not yet see. And then he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying authority without needing to raise it, asking a simple question that did not sound simple at all. Who initiated this arrest? And for a moment Daniel answered automatically, stepping forward, stating his name, his reasoning, repeating the same justification he had already written down, the same explanation that had always worked before. But as he spoke, the words began to feel thinner, less certain, like they were being weighed against something heavier, something unseen. And the man listened without interrupting, without reacting, his expression unchanged, until Daniel finished. And then there was a pause, not long, but long enough to stretch across the room like a line no one wanted to cross. And in that silence, Ava shifted slightly, just enough to draw attention back to her, not dramatically, not forcefully, just a quiet movement that reminded everyone she had never been outside of this moment. She had been at the center of it the entire time. And when the man turned back to her, his tone changed, not softer, not kinder, but more direct, more precise. "Agent Carter," he said, clearly, firmly, and the word agent did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because the effect was immediate. The room did not gasp, it did not react outwardly, but the understanding spread instantly, like a current passing through every person standing there. And Daniel stood still, the title landing harder than anything else that had happened. Because titles meant structure, titles meant hierarchy, titles meant that everything he thought he knew about this moment had just been rewritten. And Ava finally met his eyes again, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with something far more final, the quiet confirmation of a truth that had been there from the beginning, waiting for him to see it. And in that moment, Daniel Hayes realized that this was never just an arrest. It was something else entirely, something he had stepped into, without ever realizing it was already in motion. The word agent did not fade. It lingered in the air like a quiet fracture, splitting the moment into before and after, and Daniel Hayes felt it settle in his chest with a weight he could not immediately process, because everything he had relied on just seconds ago, his certainty, his authority, his instinct, now stood on unstable ground. And yet he did not step back. He did not retreat. Instead, he straightened again, forcing composure into his posture, searching for something familiar to hold onto, something procedural, something that could restore order to what was quickly slipping beyond his understanding. But the man in the suit had already moved past that point, his attention shifting fully to Ava Carter as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin folder, placing it gently on the desk as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. And when he opened it, there was no drama, no sudden reveal, just page after page of quiet detail, photographs, timestamps, reports, each one carrying a story that had never been spoken out loud in this room until now. And Ava did not look at the file. She did not need to, because she already knew what was inside. She had lived it, built it, piece by piece over time. And the man spoke again, not louder, but clearer, his words precise, each one landing exactly where it needed to, explaining that this was not a misunderstanding, not a random incident, but part of an ongoing federal investigation, one that had been carefully constructed over weeks, maybe longer. And as he spoke, the room listened differently, not as bystanders, not as observers, but as witnesses to something they had not realized they were part of. And Daniel felt the shift again, deeper this time, because the narrative was no longer his. The version of events he had created was being replaced in real time by something larger, something structured, something that did not bend to his interpretation. And for the first time, he looked at Ava not as a suspect, not as a disruption, but as a question he could not answer. And she met that look with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, unshaken, steady. Her presence no longer passive, but quietly dominant. And then she spoke, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to clarify, her voice even, controlled. Everything you did tonight was recorded, and there was no edge in her tone, no threat, just the simple delivery of fact. And the words did not create panic. They created understanding, a slow realization that this moment had not been spontaneous. It had been observed, documented, placed into a sequence that extended far beyond this room. And somewhere in the background another phone rang, another voice answered, and the system that Daniel believed he controlled continued moving forward without him. And as the man in the suit closed the folder with a quiet motion, he looked directly at Daniel, not with anger, not with judgment, but with finality, the kind that does not need to be explained, because the explanation had already been written long before this night began. And in that silence, under the steady hum of the lights, Daniel Hayes understood something he had never had to face before. This was not about proving he was right. It was about realizing he had never been in control at all. Silence did not leave the room. It deepened, settling into every corner like something that refused to be ignored. And Daniel Hayes stood there with his thoughts racing faster than his expression would ever allow. Because on the surface he still looked composed, still looked like the same officer who had walked in with confidence minutes ago. But inside something had shifted, something fundamental. The kind of shift that does not happen often and never without consequence. He glanced at the folder again, at the edges of the pages that held more weight than any report he had ever written. And for the first time he did not reach for control. He hesitated. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed. Ava Carter watched him quietly, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with a kind of clarity that came from seeing the moment exactly for what it was, a turning point, not just for him, but for everything that had led up to this. And she took a slow breath, steady, measured, as if aligning herself with the rhythm of something larger than the room itself. And then she spoke again, her voice calm, almost reflective. This did not start tonight. And the words carried further than any accusation ever could, because they were not aimed at breaking him down. They were aimed at revealing what had already been built. And Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, in the quiet struggle of trying to piece together something that no longer followed his understanding of events. And the man in the suit stepped forward just enough to reinforce the truth without raising his voice, explaining that the investigation had been ongoing, that patterns had been observed, documented, verified over time, that what happened on the street was not an isolated decision but part of a larger sequence that had been unfolding long before this moment. And as the explanation settled in, the room shifted again, not with tension this time, but with awareness, because now there was context, now there was structure, Now there was a story that extended beyond what anyone had assumed when Ava first walked through those doors, and Daniel felt it fully now. The realization that this was not about a single choice, not about a single moment, but about a pattern he had never been forced to see from the outside. And he looked at Ava again, really looked this time, past the surface, past the assumptions, searching for something he had missed, something he had overlooked, and what he found was not weakness, not defiance, but control, the kind that did not need to prove itself, the kind that simply existed, steady and unshaken. And for a brief second the room felt smaller, quieter, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away, leaving only what mattered. Truth standing where perception used to be, and Ava held his gaze without speaking, because she did not need to say anything more. The story was already unfolding, and the role he thought he was playing had already been rewritten without him realizing it. And as the man in the suit closed the distance between them slightly, his presence firm but composed, it became clear to everyone in that room that what was happening was not the end of something. It was the exposure of something that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. The truth did not arrive like a storm. It settled slowly, piece by piece, until there was no space left for anything else. And Daniel Hayes could feel it pressing in from all sides, not loud, not overwhelming, but constant, like a weight that refused to lift. And for the first time since this night began, he did not try to speak, he did not try to explain, because the words he would have used no longer fit the reality standing in front of him. The room had changed, not physically, but in the way people stood, in the way they listened, in the way their attention had shifted away from him and towards something far more significant. And Ava Carter remained exactly where she had been, unchanged, steady, her presence no longer something to question, but something to understand. And the man in the suit moved with quiet purpose, sliding one of the pages from the folder across the desk, not dramatically, not forcefully, just enough for it to exist in Daniel's space. And when Daniel looked down, he saw more than just information. He saw a timeline, structured, detailed, each moment connected to the next with a precision that did not allow for coincidence. Dates, locations, interactions, all forming a pattern that could not be dismissed. And his name appeared more than once, not highlighted, not emphasized, but present, woven into something larger than he had ever considered. And his breath slowed, not out of calm, but out of realization, because this was not about one decision, not about one night. It was about a series of moments that had never been isolated at all. And Ava watched him read without interruption, without expression, because she knew what it felt like to see the full picture for the first time, to understand that what seemed routine from one side looked entirely different from another. And when Daniel finally lifted his eyes, there was something different in them, not fear, not anger, but awareness, the kind that changes the way a person stands, the way a person listens, the way a person exists in a space they once controlled. And Ava spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. Patterns do not lie. And the words settled into the silence with a finality that no argument could undo. And the man in the suit nodded slightly, not as approval, but as confirmation, because everything that needed to be said had already been documented, recorded, placed into a structure that did not depend on opinion. And somewhere in the background the steady rhythm of the station continued, phones ringing, footsteps passing. But inside this moment everything had narrowed, focused, sharpened into something undeniable. And Daniel Hayes stood in the center of it, no longer directing the story, no longer shaping the outcome, but finally seeing it for what it truly was, not a misunderstanding, not an overreaction, but a consequence unfolding exactly the way it had been built to. And Ava Carter, who had once stood in silence under assumption, now stood in clarity, not needing to raise her voice, not needing to prove anything, because the truth had already done that for her. For a moment, it looked like everything had settled, like the truth had done its job and the room could finally breathe again. But real shifts do not announce themselves with noise. They reveal themselves in what happens next. And Daniel Hayes stood there holding the weight of everything he had just seen, trying to organize it into something that still made sense, something that still gave him ground to stand on, because part of him refused to accept that this moment defined anything beyond tonight, that it was contained, isolated, manageable. And he reached for that thought the way someone reaches for something familiar in the dark, his voice returning, controlled, measured, as he pointed out procedure, as he referenced protocol, as he reminded the room that one incident did not rewrite an entire career. And for a brief second it almost worked, not because it was true, but because it was structured. And structure has a way of sounding convincing when everything else feels uncertain. But Ava Carter did not interrupt. She did not challenge him directly. Instead, she listened, her expression unchanged, because she knew something he did not, that this moment was not about argument. It was about timing, and timing does not respond to defense. It responds to sequence. And as Daniel finished speaking, as his words settled into the space with a sense of regained control, the man in the suit did something simple. He reached into the folder again and turned to another section, one that had not yet been seen, and he placed a small device on the desk, no larger than a phone, its screen already active, already loaded. And when he pressed play, there was no dramatic sound, no sudden shock, just a voice, clear, unmistakable, echoing softly through the room. And Daniel recognized it instantly, not because it was loud, but because it was his, speaking in a tone he had never heard from the outside, captured in a moment he had long forgotten. And the room did not react with surprise, it reacted with understanding, because now the pattern was not just written, it was heard, it was undeniable, and Daniel's words from earlier began to feel distant, disconnected from what was unfolding in front of him. And he stood still, listening, not just to the recording, but to the silence that followed it, a silence that no longer felt neutral, it felt conclusive. And Ava finally shifted her gaze slightly, not toward the device, not toward the man in the suit, but toward Daniel, giving him the space to hear himself fully, to recognize what had always been there without interruption, without explanation. And when the recording ended, the absence of sound carried more weight than the audio itself, because there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to reshape. And the man in the suit closed the device with a quiet motion, his voice steady as he spoke again, not to accuse, not to escalate, but to finalize what had already been set in motion. And Daniel Hayes felt it then, not as a sudden collapse, but as a realization that had been building from the very first moment Ava Carter stood in front of him on that street, that this was never about proving anything, it was about revealing everything. And the part of the story he thought he controlled had only ever been a small piece of something much larger than himself. The room did not need another sound to understand what had just happened, because sometimes the absence of defense speaks louder than any argument ever could. And Daniel Hayes stood there with the echo of his own voice still lingering in the air, not as something distant, but as something undeniable, something that could not be reshaped or reinterpreted. And for the first time since this night began, he did not look for a way to respond. He did not search for the right words, because there were none left that could place him back in control of the narrative. And that realization did not arrive with panic. It arrived slowly, settling into his posture, into the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, into the way his eyes no longer scanned the room for support, but instead remained fixed on the space directly in front of him, as if grounding himself in a moment he could no longer escape. And Ava Carter watched this shift without interruption, her expression unchanged, not because she lacked emotion, but because this was never about reaction. It was about resolution, and resolution does not rush. It unfolds, one layer at a time, until nothing remains hidden. And the man in the suit stepped forward again, his presence now carrying a finality that did not need to be announced, as he reached into his jacket once more and removed a document, placing it carefully on the desk, aligning it with the edge as if precision itself mattered in this moment. And when he spoke, his voice remained steady, measured, but there was something different in it now, not stronger, not louder, but conclusive, as he explained that the investigation had reached a point where observation was no longer enough, that the evidence collected had moved beyond documentation into action, and that what happened tonight was not an interruption of that process, but the final confirmation it required. And Daniel listened, not as an officer, not as someone in control, but as someone being introduced to a reality that had already been defined without him. And each word seemed to close another door behind him, not with force, but with certainty. And Ava shifted her weight slightly, not as a reaction, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had arrived, the point where everything that had been built in silence was now standing fully visible. And she finally spoke again, her voice calm, grounded, carrying no anger, no urgency, just truth. This was never about one night. And the words settled into the room with a clarity that no one could misinterpret, because everyone there could now see it. The structure, the pattern, the sequence that connected everything together. And Daniel's gaze lowered briefly to the document on the desk, not reading it yet, not needing to, because he already understood what it represented, not just a piece of paper, but a transition, a shift from assumption to accountability. And as he looked back up, the room felt different, not tense, not chaotic, but resolved, like a story that had finally reached the point where nothing more needed to be proven, only acknowledged. And Ava Carter stood at the center of that moment, not as someone who had taken control, but as someone who had never lost it. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, holding within it the quiet weight of everything that had just been revealed. The moment did not explode. It settled. And in that settling there was no room left for denial, because everything that could have been questioned had already been answered, not through argument, but through evidence, through time, through patterns that refused to disappear. And Daniel Hayes stood there with the document still untouched in front of him, his hand hovering just slightly above the desk, as if reaching for something he no longer fully understood, because touching it would mean accepting it. And accepting it would mean acknowledging that the version of reality he had trusted for so long had already shifted without his permission. And across from him, Ava Carter remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer something that needed to assert itself, because it already filled the space in a way that could not be ignored. And the man in the suit watched carefully, not with pressure, not with urgency, but with the quiet patience of someone who knew that the final step did not need to be forced. It only needed to be recognized. And in that silence, Daniel finally lowered his hand onto the paper, not quickly, not confidently, but deliberately, as if each inch of movement carried weight. And when his fingers made contact with the edge, there was no dramatic reaction, no visible collapse, just a subtle shift in his expression, a realization that settled deeper than anything spoken aloud. And he looked down, reading now, not searching for errors, not looking for a way out, but seeing what had already been established, the language clear, structured, leaving no space for reinterpretation. And as his eyes moved across the lines, the room remained quiet, not because it was waiting, but because it understood that this was the moment where everything became real. And Ava watched him without interruption, her gaze steady, not intrusive, not distant, simply present, because she had already walked this path long before he ever reached this point. She had already seen the full picture when he was still looking at fragments, and now he was catching up to something she had known all along. And when he finally lifted his head again, there was no resistance left in his eyes, no attempt to reclaim control, only recognition, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And the man in the suit gave a small nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the process had reached its conclusion. And Ava took a slow breath, steady, grounded, as if marking the end of something that had taken far longer than this night to unfold. And then she spoke. One last time, her voice calm, unwavering. The truth does not rush, but it always arrives. And the words did not land as a statement of victory, but as a reflection of what had just happened, because this was never about confrontation. It was about clarity. And in that moment, under the steady light of the station, with the sound of the world continuing just beyond those walls, Daniel Hayes understood that what he had walked into as routine had become something far greater, something that could not be undone, only accepted. And the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was resolved, carrying with it the quiet finality of a truth that had finally been seen in full. Nothing moved quickly after that, and that was what made it real. Because real consequences do not arrive with noise, they settle into place with quiet precision. And Daniel Hayes remained where he stood, the document still in his hands, no longer something to resist, no longer something to question, but something that had already taken its place in the reality around him. And the room, once filled with subtle tension and shifting uncertainty, now felt grounded, anchored by something that did not need to be argued or defended. And Ava Carter took a small step back, not retreating, not distancing herself, but allowing the moment to fully exist without her needing to hold it together anymore. Because her role in this had never been to force the outcome. It had been to reveal it, and that work was now complete. The man in the suit closed the folder with a calm, deliberate motion, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carrying a quiet finality that signaled the transition from investigation to consequence. And around them, the station slowly resumed its rhythm. Conversations restarting, footsteps continuing. But there was a difference now, a subtle awareness that lingered in the way people glanced over, in the way voices lowered slightly, because everyone understood that something significant had just unfolded in front of them, something that would not be undone by time or routine. And Daniel lowered the document back onto the desk, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action now carried a weight it did not have before. And he looked up once more, not searching for answers, not looking for control, but acknowledging what had already been set in motion. And Ava met that look with the same steady calm she had carried from the very beginning, unchanged by the outcome, unchanged by the shift, because for her this was not a moment of victory, it was a moment of completion. And she spoke one final time, her voice quiet but clear. It was always going to end this way. And there was no satisfaction in her tone, no judgment, just the simple truth of a process that had followed its course. And the man in the suit gave a small nod, signaling that there was nothing more to be added, nothing more to be explained, because everything that needed to happen had already begun. And as Ava turned slightly, preparing to leave the space she had once entered in silence, the room did not stop her. It did not question her. It simply made way, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. And Daniel Hayes remained still for a moment longer, the weight of the night settling fully into place, because for the first time he was not stepping into the next moment with certainty, he was stepping into it with awareness, and that awareness would follow him far beyond this room, far beyond this night, long after the sound of voices and footsteps faded back into routine. Because some moments do not end when they are over, they continue in what they leave behind, and this was one of them. The door did not slam behind Ava Carter as she stepped out of the station. It closed softly, almost unnoticed, but the weight of what remained inside did not follow her. It stayed, settling into the walls, into the desks, into the quiet spaces where assumptions had once lived unchallenged, and outside the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. The kind that blurred the city lights just enough to make everything feel distant, like a memory already beginning to fade. But Ava did not rush, she did not look back. She simply walked forward with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning, her steps measured, her posture calm, because for her this night was never about the moment, it was about the outcome, and that outcome had already been secured long before anyone realized it was happening. And inside the station, Daniel Hayes remained where he was, not frozen, not lost, but still, in a way he had never experienced before, because stillness now meant something different. It was not control, it was reflection, the kind that does not arrive on command but stays long after everything else has moved on. And the room around him slowly returned to its routine. Conversations resumed, phones rang, paperwork continued, but none of it felt the same. Not because the world had changed, but because his place within it had shifted, and that shift could not be undone. And as he looked down at the desk one last time, at the space where the document had rested, at the edge where the folder had been closed, he understood something that had never been clear to him before, that authority without awareness is not strength, it is blindness, and blindness does not last forever, because sooner or later, something forces you to see, and when you do, you cannot return to what you believed before. And across the street the reflection of the station lights shimmered in the wet pavement, fading with each passing second, just like the version of this night he had once thought he understood. And somewhere in that fading reflection was the moment he made a choice without knowing what it would lead to, a choice that did not define everything, but revealed everything. And Ava Carter continued walking into the quiet night, not carrying anger, not carrying triumph, but carrying something far more powerful, the truth, steady, unshaken, and unafraid of time, because truth does not need to chase anything. It waits, it watches, and when the moment is right, it steps forward, exactly when it is needed. And as the city moved on around her, unaware of the shift that had just taken place. One thing remained certain. He thought he was the law when he made that choice, but that night, the law had already chosen him.